These events involved 11 people, excluding herself and her political staff, from the Prime Minister's office, the Privy Council office, and the office of the Minister of Finance. This included in-person conversations, telephone calls, emails, and text messages. She also testified that while she couldn't discuss why she resigned as Veteran Affairs Minister, or in fact anything else that was said or happened after she was replaced as Attorney General, unless she was cleared to do so by another order in Council, she had more to say. Now, Liberal members of the Justice Committee denied her that opportunity at the March 19th closed-door meeting when they voted to prematurely shut down their incomplete study. I believe, and I hope it's shared by members on both sides of the table, that it is entirely proper, entirely appropriate for this House Standing Committee on Ethics to examine the incomplete evidence and the many issues raised by Ms. Wilson-Raybould that are fully within the purview of this committee's mandate to investigate matters as they pertain to ethics. Now, to be clear, I'm not suggesting that the committee interfere with the narrow investigation that the Ethics Commissioner announced in his February 11th letter. As you'll recall, Commissioner Dion disagreed with a request that he undertake an investigation of the Prime Minister under Section 7 of the Conflict of Interest Act, which prohibits a public office holder from giving preferential treatment to any person or organization. But the Commissioner did find reason to act. He said, quote, "I have reason to believe that a possible contravention of Section 9 may have occurred." Section 9, of course, prohibits a public office holder from seeking to influence a decision of another person so as to improperly further another person's private interests. And the Commissioner concluded in that letter that he has initiated an examination under subsection 45(1) of the Conflict of Interest Act. But as I communicated to the chair in requesting this meeting, there is a wide range of issues across the ethics spectrum, that are left unexamined in the prematurely closed Justice Committee study. I believe Canadians deserve to hear the full truth. It's unacceptable that our Liberal colleagues, the majority on the Justice Committee, clearly acting on directions from the Prime Minister's office, decided they didn't want to hear any more from the former Attorney General or any of the 9 other individuals implicated in the sustained pressure allegations made by the former Attorney General. There remain many unanswered questions related to the former Attorney General's resignation from Cabinet, the presentation she gave to Cabinet after her resignation, and the discussion she had after being replaced as Attorney General. I thank you, Chair, for your confirmation in the House last week that an investigation by this committee, the Ethics Committee, is or would be in order. I hope that Liberal members of the committee agree and will exercise the independence that the Prime Minister claims all committee members enjoy. I sincerely hope that we will see a manifestation of that independence in agreement today, that we study elements of the deeply troubling affair blocked by Liberal members of the Justice Committee. And as a first step, I wish to move the following motion: that given the public statement on March 14th by Ms. Jody Wilson-Raybould that this matter is serious and some questions remain unanswered, and given the public statement of March 21st by Ms. Jane Philpott that there is much more to this story that needs to be told, the committee A, immediately begin a study of the ongoing corruption scandal involving the Prime Minister. B, instruct the chair to write to the Prime Minister requesting that he waive all constraints that may prevent individuals invited to appear before the committee from speaking freely. C, invite Ms. Jody Wilson-Raybould to appear as a witness in this study no later than April 5th. D, invite Ms. Jane Philpott to appear as a witness in this study no later than April 5th. And E, that upon conclusion of this study, a report of the findings of this committee be tabled in Parliament. Now, the Prime Minister has deflected questions of formally allowing Ms. Wilson-Raybould to speak. He cites an unprecedented waiver already, and of course it was an unprecedented waiver to address an unprecedented scandal, but it doesn't extend far enough, as my motion specifies. He should make it official, and he should remove all constraints, first on her and any other witnesses that may be called to appear before committee. Now, why does this matter, Mr. Chair? And because this is a new issue before this committee, I would like to put onto the record some of the relevant facts supporting the motion that's before us. It matters because Canada is a nation founded on the rule of law. Who one knows in the PMO should not get one special favors. On March 8th, in a case related to this matter, the federal court ruled the independence of the Attorney General is essential and fundamental to the criminal justice system. 5 former Attorneys General across partisan lines wrote to the RCMP Commissioner to express concern that a crime has been committed. Retired Judge Mary Ellen Turpin-Lafond described the ongoing scandal as a constitutional crisis. The head of the Canadian Civil Liberties Association and former Ontario Liberal Attorney General Michael Bryant said, "A lot of police officers have laid a lot of obstruction of justice charges on a lot of ordinary Canadians with a lot less evidence than this." I will remind the committee, those that might not have viewed Ms. Wilson-Raybould's original testimony before the Justice Committee, of some of the things that she said. Quote, "For a period of approximately 4 months between September and December of 2018, I, Ms. Wilson-Raybould, experienced a consistent and sustained effort by many people within the government to seek to politically interfere in the exercise of prosecutorial discretion in my role, her role, as the Attorney General of Canada, in an inappropriate effort to secure a deferred prosecution agreement with SNC-Lavalin." Another quote, "The conversation that I had where they became very clearly inappropriate was when political issues came up, like the election in Quebec, like losing the election if SNC were to move their headquarters." She said as well, "There were express statements regarding the necessity of interference in the SNC-Lavalin matter, the potential of consequences and veiled threats if a deferred prosecution agreement was not made available to SNC. And Ms. Wilson-Raybould said, "I had determined that I was not going to issue a directive. It was inappropriate to interfere with the discretion of the Director of Public Prosecutions, and having made up my mind, her mind, taking into account all of the information again, for those who know me," she said, "I was not going to change my mind." There were other quotes, again, in her testimony. She said, for example, quoting the former Principal Secretary in the Prime Minister's office, Gerald Butts, saying, "There is no solution that doesn't involve some interference." She said that, in quoting Katie Telford in the Prime Minister's office, "We don't want to debate legalities anymore." She said that she testified that she spoke to Minister Morneau on this matter. "I told him," she said, "that engagements from his office to mine on SNC had to stop, that they were inappropriate. They did not stop." She said, and I quote, PMO advisor Matthew Bouchard said, "We can have the best policy in the world, but we need to be re-elected." Now, Mr. Speaker, we have seen on numerous occasions in the past almost 2 months now, the Prime Minister change the story, to change the excuses that he offers for why there was what he considers to be appropriate interference, which the former Attorney General rejected as inappropriate. The Prime Minister has claimed thousands of jobs were at risk if SNC-Lavalin were to be convicted. This was debunked by academics, and it was widely panned as a naive assumption at best, or a falsehood, or manipulation at worst. And of course, we heard from SNC-Lavalin's Chief Executive Officer Neil Bruce that the suggestion of 9,000 jobs could disappear if SNC is blocked from a deferred prosecution agreement. He said, that's incorrect, and we've never said that. Now, is there more information, in fact, for this committee to hear on the matter? Well, on March 14th, Ms. Jody Wilson-Raybould said, this matter is serious. Some questions remain unanswered. On March 21st, Ms. Jane Philpott said that, quote, there is much more to this story that needs to be told. And she said, I believe the former Attorney General has further points to make. I believe that I have further issues of concern that I am not free to share. Now, we know that the story has changed many times, as I said, over the past almost 2 months. The most recent and I think disgusting act of desperation from the Prime Minister's office, or from someone who at one point was in the Prime Minister's office, came out yesterday with a leak of highly sensitive, confidential information, smearing a highly respected member of the judiciary in an attempt to distract from the Prime Minister's attempted interference in a criminal trial and a cover-up of that attempted interference. We heard from the Chief Justice of the Manitoba Court of Queen's Bench regretfully being forced to come forward to make a statement, having been drawn into this sorry affair, to say, and I quote, I fear someone is using my previous candidacy to Supreme Court to further an agenda unrelated to the appointment process. And Chair and colleagues, this breach of the confidentiality of what is supposed to be a highly confidential judicial appointment process is serious enough to require an investigation on its own. But it is part of this, and it is included in, again, the widely changing, continually changing story of from the Prime Minister. This sort of leak, we've been told again by experts in law in the past couple of days, that this sort of leak could compromise the integrity of judicial appointment process. It could compromise the integrity of institutions, and potentially could compromise the integrity of sitting justices. Now, I'm sure that my Liberal colleagues, and I respect them, we've worked well together on a number of difficult issues in the past couple of years in creating studies within the broad purview of our ethics committee's various mandates. I know they've heard, I certainly have, from my constituents about concerns, and I'm sure that they will continue to hear from their constituents, as I expect I will, until all of the facts are out, until this matter is resolved. And Chair, just to wrap up my first intervention, I must say, and I compliment the Liberal Vice Chair of this committee in his op-ed commentary today in a Toronto newspaper, where he said, outside of 3 categories of whipped votes, a member of Parliament should be free to register their disagreement with the Liberal government on matters of policy and principle, and to remain in the Liberal caucus. He said, and again, I would advise all to read the complete op-ed, but in the interest of time, I will simply go to 2 further quotes. But Mr. Erskine Smith wrote, our responsibility is to ensure that our legislative decisions are reflective of our collective obligations to the Liberal Party, but to our constituents, to the evidence, and to the public interest. South of the border, Mr. Erskine Smith wrote, we can see the ongoing damage wrought when representatives put party before country, and we should work to avoid similar outcomes here at home. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Kent. Next up, we have a speaking order. Next up for the second motion of the day, Ms. Ramsey.
I'd actually like to speak to this motion. And, you know, the NDP has been committed to getting to the truth on this. And I think that's been clear throughout our efforts throughout this entire thing. And this is why we've repeatedly called for a public independent inquiry, is because what happened at the Justice Committee and what we've seen happening at the Ethics Commissioner, which is beyond the scope to be quite frank, of what the Ethics Commissioner can do. We believe that to get to the truth, we need a public, independent inquiry. And we're using all the tools that we can to get to the truth. We participated in the Justice Committee. I sat at the Justice Committee process. We called for the Ethics Commissioner to investigate, and now we're here supporting this motion at the Ethics Committee. It's obvious to us and to Canadians that the Liberals are using their power to silence the former Attorney General and the former President of the Treasury Board. For some reason, Mr. Chair, Liberals do not want this story to be heard. And, you know, I've heard it repeated by my Liberal colleagues here and others throughout their party that Ms. Wilson-Raybould has already had her opportunity. You know, I've heard them say that she's had 4 hours to have her say, and that's good enough for them. They've actually made
I'm
a
just going to
decision.
clarify something as chair. Is we have one motion on
Yes.
the table, so that you're speaking to that. So we'll
Yes.
have to vote on that first, and then your motion can come after that. Just to be clear.
Okay, I'm going to move an amendment at the end of my
Go ahead. So you're still speaking to Mr. Kent's
I am,
motion,
yes.
correct?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Thank you. So we've heard these lines repeated that Ms. Wilson-Raybould had 4 hours to have her say, and that's good enough. Now, Liberals have made up their mind. They think that everything she's had to say is out, which we know isn't true, because we know she herself, Ms. Wilson-Raybould, has said both publicly and in writing that she has more to say. And now Ms. Philpott, in her article in Maclean's last week, indicated she also has some things to contribute to this conversation. And Canadians want to hear what they have to say. You know, I think that this isn't good enough for Canadians. And every place that I go in my riding of Essex and my New Democrat colleagues, people are talking about this. To think that this is just somehow an Ottawa bubble story and no one's paying attention to it because it's too difficult to understand all of the moving pieces in this, which, you know, I frankly understand because it's been changing every single day, this story. But people are talking about it. I went to the post office, a lady was talking to me about it in there. She knew Jody Wilson-Raybould's name and Miss Philpott's name and was using it and saying, we want them to speak the truth. I was in airport security yesterday to come here, and the screener was talking to me about this. They want these women to come and speak. People who typically don't pay attention to politics are gripped by this story. And to see the budget come and go and no one even be talking about the budget tells us that Canadians are not ready to let this story go. And I think the motion that's being brought before us today is about getting to the truth. So we're willing to use all the tools that are available. And you know, I think if the Prime Minister at this point won't do the right thing and expand this waiver, which is what's being asked, to expand the scope of the order in council, then we have to have a full public inquiry. And he has to let these former cabinet ministers at the very least speak because of the indication that they've given that they would like to and that they have something substantive to contribute to this story. You know, when Jane Philpott last week said that there's much more to the SNC-Lavalin affair and Canadians have concerns about the government's attempts to shut down the story, that rings true to me. And I can tell from the op-ed this morning that my colleague, Mr. Erickson-Smith, feels the same way, that that's ringing true, that people are talking about this, that people want the truth, and that as elected officials, that's actually the obligation that we have. Our obligation isn't to the party that we represent, it's actually to those constituents and to Canadians as a whole when we're sitting at this committee space. So I want to talk a little bit about the Justice Committee and what happened there. And, you know, a lot of people told us that they felt that that was the best place for the study, for the truth, for everything to come out at the Justice Committee. But the Liberals were quite clear that they had no desire to see that happen at the Justice Committee. You know, they used every tool available to them to shut down the debate, to shut down the conversation, to essentially end the study. We don't have an ongoing study anymore at the Justice Committee to get to the bottom of this. And that's concerning because this isn't just about Canada. The OECD is watching what we're doing here, and our minister had to provide them, you know, a letter saying, yes, we will have, you know, robust investigation that will happen at the Justice Committee. Well, that's no longer happening. So what is the answer or the response to the Globe right now about us trying to, you know, pull our own weight and really stick with our international commitments that we've made, not just in words, but in writing, something that's a standard that we're held to, and we can't just skate away from that. So the Ethics Committee is another opportunity for a study to happen, I think, that would satisfy the global community and let them know that our commitments are serious and that we take them seriously. So the Justice Committee, you know, the Liberal majority, in my opinion, did not act in good faith at that committee. They did not. We moved 3 motions for the NDP to have Jody Wilson-Raybould testify again on February 27th, March 6th, March 13th, and they were consistently voted down and ignored. So this is another opportunity, I think, for Liberals to understand that this isn't a story that's going away. Canadians want the truth, and so this is another opportunity to get to that truth. Ms. Wilson-Raybould was repeatedly denied the opportunity to return to the Justice Committee, even though we saw the former Privy Council clerk, Michael Wernick, come back, and he refuted the testimony that she had given. Fundamentally, that's unfair. She has a right of reply. That's just a fundamental unfairness that she was not able to come back and address the comments that were made about her. And I hope that her colleagues who sit on this committee see that for the injustice that it was, and that she deserves a right to be able to speak to what was said about her. And we moved motions to hear from everyone that was implicated in her testimony, and these were consistently voted down. And we heard from 3 people out of 11. There are still other players that were named that are involved in this that need the opportunity to come forward and speak, and quite frankly, clear their own names, because some pretty incriminating things were said about them. So I'm sure that those people do not want this to follow their career either, and would welcome the opportunity to come and sit before this committee now to be able to air the truth. And, you know, I'm talking about, you know, people who are sitting at the highest level. We're talking about 4 resignations, but we're talking about the former Attorney General's Chief of Staff. We're talking about the current Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister. We're talking about 2 PMO staff members who are still sitting there. I would imagine that they would like the opportunity to come before the committee, and I hope you'll extend that to them, because as at the bare minimum in terms of fairness and a courtesy, I think that they deserve that as well. So what happened? We saw what happened. They voted to shut down debate. They adjourned the debate. And, you know, again, last week they shut down the entire study. So now there's nothing to happen at the Justice Committee, although we saw this letter come from Ms. Wilson-Raybould to the Justice Committee last week. That was in direct response to questions that were asked by Mr. Rankin during her testimony. So she will provide some of the documents and the text messages that were requested of her. She alluded to a report in her letter. There is no such report. There's no report to come from the Justice Committee, because the Liberal members on the Justice Committee have shut any opportunity for that down. So there's nothing going forward there. And again, we have to understand that Ms. Wilson-Raybould, you know, will only be addressing those direct questions that were asked of her in her response. But the question I think that's outstanding is why the Liberal members on that committee did not want to get to the truth. And so I hope that the Liberal members on this committee, who do hold the majority here, are really seriously considering what has been happening around our country, and the fact that this isn't going away. Every single day there's a new bombshell that's coming out in this, and the best path for all of us is to go to the truth. When the truth comes out, then we can deal with the fallout of that. But as long as you continue to block, and I really sincerely hope that won't be the case here today, that there won't be a movement to adjourn, there won't be a movement to go in camera, that there won't be an attempt to once again put things behind closed doors that Canadians are strongly indicating they do not want to see. I want to address a comment that was made, and it's been a theme, a very horrible theme, I think, of this entire thing, and it's been the attempt to smear these very credible, intelligent women. We saw certainly a smear campaign against Ms. Wilson-Raybould that continued yesterday, to be honest, in this debacle of, you know, somehow again this frame that she's difficult, that she was, you know, difficult to work with. If she's so difficult to work with, then why was the Prime Minister offering her the Indigenous file, which by his own admission is the most important relationship that exists? So, you know, this doesn't hold water, that she's difficult, but we're going to give her the best file, the most important file that we have. You know, this doesn't add up, and Canadians can see through these attempts. But what Ms. Scrow said shocked people, I think, on the weekend, when she said that she wanted Ms. Wilson-Raybould and Ms. Philpott to put up or shut up. First of all, I don't know who speaks to their colleagues that way. I can tell you that my colleagues in the New Democratic Party would never speak to me in that manner. That's misogynistic, that's sexist, and coming from a woman, a senior woman, is even more shocking. I hope that you'll address this issue with your colleague. She needs to issue an apology. And I don't think an apology just to the people that she's discussing it. It's to women parliamentarians. We have 26% women sitting in this parliament. And how on earth are we going to attract strong, intelligent women to this parliament if the message is, if you don't go along with your party, if you don't protect the prime minister, then you better shut up? Because the interpretation of this that I got wasn't put up or shut up. It was shut up or we'll find a way to shut you up. And women in Canada will not tolerate that. So I do hope you'll address that with your colleague. And I hope that she'll actually retract that statement and understand the impact that it has on young women who are going to be filling our parliament in another week and the daughters of the vote. So I implore you as colleagues to please address that issue within your caucus and with Ms. Grow directly. But these comments, really, I think speak to Canadians that the Liberals are more interested in protecting the Prime Minister than finding the truth. And your political future, my political future, is not more important than the truth. And I think this is what Mr. Erskine-Smith wrote in his op-ed today, is basically that we are here to get to the truth. We are not here to serve the parties that we're in. We can disagree with the parties that we're in. We can do so in a respectful way. We can do so in a way that's in line with our party values. But when we try to block the truth from Canadians and block our colleagues from being able to speak that truth, there's something fundamentally wrong there. And so I really implore you today to support this. And I think also, I mentioned this at the Justice Committee last week, that the Liberal Party campaigned on transparency and accountability. This is not transparency and accountability. And you can't continue to say one thing and do another, because it's just putting a lot of doubt in Canadians' minds about what is happening here. And we're talking about, the Prime Minister's office, corporations having access to the Prime Minister's office, being able to write laws, and then when they can't use those laws, the Prime Minister using his power to pressure the one person who can change their mind to do so. This is serious, and Canadians understand this. And I think it would be a grave mistake for Liberal members to think that Canadians don't understand what this is all about. This is actually the fear that Canadians have. When a constituent walks through my office and they're being sent, a refusal for EI because they wrote one thing wrong in their application, that's not fair. And so they're coming to me to help them. So how do I then turn around and say to those constituents, well, guess what? There are different rules that apply for you and that apply to the Prime Minister of Canada. And that's the message that you're sending to Canadians. You have to do all the right things. You can't even, breach anything or be in view of breaching anything, or you'll be prevented from receiving the services that are owed to you when you have the Prime Minister who's doing the exact opposite. So I really implore you to take that seriously, because that's what Canadians are paying attention to. And I want to talk about the oath, because there's been a lot of discussion about the oath that Jody Wilson-Raybould and Dr. Philpott took. And, there's been a lot of speculation. Well, they could stand up in Parliament. They could, have parliamentary privilege. You're asking them to take an incredible risk on something that hasn't been tested to that length, to be quite honest. And these are professional, intelligent, strong women, and I don't blame them for not wanting to take that risk that they'll wear for the rest of their lives. And I think it's actually disgraceful that you're asking them to do that. There's one person who can change this. And, well, first I'll get back to the oath, because I want to read this section of the oath. And the reason why I think we heard Ms. Philpott say she's taking it seriously, the reason why I think Jody Wilson-Raybould is taking it so seriously, and I'll read this one section. I shall keep secret all matters committed and revealed to me in this capacity, or that shall be secretly treated of in council. Generally, in all things I shall do as a faithful and true servant ought to do for Her Majesty, so help me God. So this line is something that they take incredibly seriously, and you're asking them to break that. I'm asking you, and you Democrats are asking you, to go to your Prime Minister and have him, with a stroke of a pen, he could do it right now, he could do it right after this meeting, expand the order in council. Lift the waiver and let them say what they want to say, what they've indicated strongly they want to. Why are you asking them to jeopardize themselves, to jeopardize their careers, to jeopardize their oath, to potentially be under some type of, legal case following them standing up? I don't understand that. I really don't. And again, as a colleague, I don't know how you impose that on your own colleague in your own caucus to say, I'm going to prevent you from speaking the truth. I will not go to the Prime Minister and say that. I can't comprehend that. And I think it's very unfortunate. And I do believe that there are a lot of Liberal members who don't believe that that's the proper path either. So, you know, I really implore you in this particular motion around expanding the order in council to stop asking Jody Wilson-Raybould and stop asking Jane Philpott to break everything that they've said they cannot do, and to go back and do the one thing they're asking you to do, and that's to expand it so they can speak. It's so simple. It really is. And fundamentally, it's fair. And I think that Canadians understand that. And I think that all of you, I hope, understand that. So I think I'll leave it at that, but I would like to introduce my amendment at this point, Mr. Chair, if I can read it into the record. Yes? Okay, it's being distributed. I'll read it into the record. So the amendment is as follows: that Clause A of the motion be replaced with the following. A, immediately begin a study pursuant to Standing Order 108-3H6 to review any federal legislation, regulation, or standing order which impacts the ethical standards of public office holders as it relates to the question of exerting inappropriate pressure on the Attorney General of Canada for political or other reasons with respect to decisions regarding whether to proceed with a criminal prosecution, and that a vote on this motion be conducted while the committee is open to the public. So I think that this speaks to the mandate of this committee. And, you know, there's been some confusion in the public about whether or not the Ethics Committee is the appropriate place, whether it's the mandate of this committee, which New Democrats feel strongly that it is. And, you know, I think that moving this amendment offers some clarity. And I think the second half is talking about the vote being open to the public. You know, Canadians have been clear that they don't support the efforts of this Liberal government to bring things behind closed doors and to keep them from Canadians. And I think that's the rationale that we're offering here in having the vote in public and being transparent to Canadians.
Thank you, Mr. Ramsey. We have Mr. Polyev to speak next to the amendment. Mr. Polyev, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Today I'm going to do something a little bit unusual. I'm going to spend almost all of my time quoting Liberals. Instead of offering my opinion, I'll offer theirs. And let me start by quoting the testimony that gave rise to this entire matter. And I quote, "I experienced a consistent and sustained effort by many people within the government to seek to politically interfere in the exercise of prosecutorial discretion in my role as the Attorney General of Canada in an inappropriate effort to secure a deferred prosecution agreement with SNC-Lavalin." Those are the words from the woman to whom the Prime Minister of Canada entrusted the role of the Crown's top law officer, the Attorney General herself. Next, I will quote the person that the Prime Minister thought was most qualified to handle Indigenous relations, healthcare, and finally the Treasury Board, which is one of the central agencies of the Government of Canada. She wrote, "I felt there was evidence of an attempt to politically interfere with the justice system in its work on the criminal trial that had been described by some as the most important and serious prosecution of corporate corruption in modern Canadian history." End quote. Now, I note that when she speaks of this important and serious prosecution of corporate corruption, she is referring to the allegations of over $100 million of fraud and bribery leveled against SNC-Lavalin. Before I go further, I want to address the racist notion that these kinds of crimes have no victims, that this is just the way things are done in certain countries. Canada is party to international treaties against corruption, the purpose of which is to put an end to wealthy Western countries impoverishing developing nations through systematic and parasitical corruption. It is not just the way things are in African countries. And we should never allow our companies to think that they can get off while bribing those countries' leaders and robbing those people of their money. And that is exactly what SNC-Lavalin is accused of. It stands accused of bribing Libyan dictator Muammar Gaddafi with a whole series of gifts, including prostitutes for his son, in order, in return, to extract $100 million from the poorest, among the poorest people in the world. So this is not a victimless crime. This is not just the way things are done over there. And we have a duty to hold our companies to a higher standard than that. No more winking, no more nudging, full criminal prosecution where evidence merits it. Now, the allegation is that the Prime Minister went to extraordinary lengths to avoid such prosecution. And let me just review that those particular lengths. First of all, he jammed an amendment to the criminal code into an omnibus budget bill. Since when do we amend the criminal code in a budget bill? Liberals on the Finance Committee, who discovered it late night as they were going through the 600-page document, were astonished. The chairman of the committee said he didn't think it belonged in a budget bill. That is a Liberal. As I said, I would be relying on the words of Liberals. The Liberal member for Hull Elmer, Greg Fergus, said that he thought the amendment to the criminal code amounted to a slap on the wrist for large corporate criminals, that it would create a justice system where people were more punished for stealing $10 than for stealing $10 million. All that being said, the amendment became law. And after it did, the Prime Minister's office engaged in, again, what Liberals describe, and I'm going to quote some words here. Some of them are verbs, some of them are nouns. Harassed, hounded, veiled threats, bullying, and more. These are the words that I'm taking from current members of the Liberal caucus. Up until recently, among the most senior ministers in the Prime Minister's government. If Liberals now say that the people who uttered these words have no credibility, well, they weren't saying that only 2 months ago when these same people were actually administering large departments with immense power. So I come back. What would motivate a Prime Minister to engage in this kind of activity? To amend the criminal code to help a company get off charges, to then engage in sustained and consistent interference, to harass, hound, issue veiled threats, and carry out bullying. What would be behind that move? Well, originally, we were told it was jobs. That if the company didn't get off the charges, that it would, 9,000 jobs would disappear and the headquarters would move. Well, just days ago, the CEO of SNC-Lavalin said both of those claims are false. And let me show the discrepancy. The Attorney General says the Prime Minister twice claimed to her that the headquarters of SNC-Lavalin would leave if she did not immediately help shelve the charges against the company. Prime Minister has later denied making that comment. Unfortunately for him, he had repeated it at his press conference on March 8th, where he said, "We had heard representations from various sources, including the company itself, that this was an issue of deep concern to them and that the trial would potentially have consequences as dire as the company having to leave Canada altogether." He claims the company told him that. Well, Neil Bruce, the CEO, let me quote what the Toronto Star said in December. CEO Neil Bruce also insisted the company is committed to remaining headquartered in Montreal. We absolutely want to be based here in Quebec, here in Canada. BNN asked him, did you threaten to move your headquarters from Montreal? No. Never? No. Mr. Bruce, I don't know what people make up or why they or what they have in their minds. So the Prime Minister said the company headquarters would be gone if he didn't, if the charges proceeded. And now we know from the company itself, from the statements by the CEO, I might add also from public filings showing the company has to stay in Montreal as part of a loan agreement, and from public press releases showing the headquarters is signed in for a 20-year lease in Montreal, and that headquarters has just recently been renovated to keep its employees in Montreal. We now know that the Prime Minister's claim that the headquarters and the company would leave Canada was patently false. So it wasn't about jobs, which raises two additional questions. One, if he wasn't protecting jobs, who was he protecting? And two, Mr. Chair, we're not just investigating whether the Prime Minister interfered in a criminal prosecution, but whether he and his team lied to the Attorney General about the prospect of the company headquarters leaving in order to manipulate the Attorney General into shelving the charges based on false information. These are questions that we need investigated. These are questions we never had an opportunity to investigate at the Justice Committee. Another question. Today, Canadian Press and CTV reported that effectively that Gerald Butts lied to the Justice Committee. He claimed that Jody Wilson-Raybould was moved out of her position as Attorney General because of a musical chairs phenomenon that resulted from Scott Bryson's resignation. Today, CTV and CP report that no, it wasn't because of that. It was because the Prime Minister didn't like her choice of judges. We need to find out which story the Prime Minister's office is sticking with on that question today. Now, our friends, the Prime Minister has said, enough has been said. We know everything we need to know. We need to know. Time to move on. Well, let me go back to quoting Liberals on that question. This is Jody Wilson-Raybould's letter to the chairman of the Justice Committee. She's writing here about the waiver that allowed her to appear before the committee. And she says of the waiver, that the OIC addresses only my time as Attorney General of Canada and therefore does nothing to release me from any restrictions that apply to communications while I served as Minister of Veterans Affairs and in relation to my resignation from that post or my presentation to Cabinet after I resigned. Why is that important? Because we know that in the period after she was removed as Attorney General, she witnessed something that was so egregious it required she resign from Cabinet altogether. Now, do we know why she resigned? Well, she can't say because of the aforementioned restrictions contained in the Prime Minister's limited waiver. So let me illustrate the problems that limitation caused at the Justice Committee. Deputy Conservative Leader Lisa Raitt, for clarity, can you tell us what you discussed with the Prime Minister at your meetings in Vancouver on February 11th? Jody Wilson-Raybould, I cannot. Can you tell us what was discussed with the Cabinet on February 19th? I cannot. Can you tell us why you've resigned from Cabinet? I cannot. These are examples of things that she has not been allowed to speak about. Now, some Liberals have suggested that she had unlimited license to speak and say anything she wanted because of parliamentary privilege. This is merely a distraction. If that were really the position of the Prime Minister, he would have said so instead of issuing a limited waiver at the outset, and furthermore, he wouldn't have limited the time frame of that waiver. It is merely a procedural distraction. As the old saying goes, complexity is the last refuge of the scoundrel. So let me further quote Liberals on this matter. I'm now going to quote current Liberal Member of Parliament and former Treasury Board President, who says, and I quote, on the matter of whether there is more to discuss, and I'm quoting, "There's much more to the story that needs to be told." She goes on, "There's been an attempt to shut down the story," end quote. Again, that is a Liberal. This is not an allegation from a Conservative or a New Democrat. This is a present sitting member of the Liberal caucus, someone to whom the Prime Minister had recently entrusted 3 very senior cabinet positions. So you don't need to take our word for it. You can just listen to what Liberals themselves are saying. And keeping with Liberals' comments on this matter, Judy Sgro, Liberal MP, has implored all of you to vote in favor of allowing this study to go ahead. She has said that she believes Jody Wilson-Raybould and Jane Philpott should, and I quote, "put up or shut up." Those were her words. So we could let them do that. We could let them put up their testimony before us in this committee. If Liberals, backbenchers, and Liberal ministers who are going out and telling the media that they just want Wilson-Raybould and Philpott to just say what they got to say, well, let's invite them here to say it. Now, Ms. Sgro was not obviously just speaking for herself, because the Prime Minister's democracy minister Karina Gould, went out and said that they should put it on the record. Everything else they have to say, put it on the record. Well, we can do that right here at the Ethics Committee. So if these Liberals, including a current Liberal cabinet minister, are being honest and sincere, and they really want to give Jody Wilson-Raybould and Jane Philpott the ability to put up or shut up, or put it on the record, as they've said in their own words, then Liberal members should honor the wishes of Ms. Sgro and Ms. Gould and vote in favor of letting them do that. So the decision for Liberals representing the Prime Minister on the committee today is this: are you going to put up or cover up? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Polyev. Next up, we have, again, speaking to the amendment, Mr. Blakey. Go ahead, Mr. Blakey.
Thank you very much. So I do want to add what I hope is a new contribution to the debate in a moment. I mean, we've heard that that what's at issue is not just a victimless crime. It's why the OECD Anti-Bribery Unit has taken an interest in this, which I think is a serious taint on Canada's reputation, and one that we'd like to see corrected as quickly as possible. I think we've heard many arguments over the last number of weeks, and including here today, about the importance of the rule of law and what it means to live in a country where top political leaders feel free to interfere in decisions that ought to be independent when we talk about criminal prosecutions. I think it's something that Canadians don't want to see happening in their own country, and there's serious concern about the allegations that it has, that kind of inappropriate political pressure has been put. I think, simply asking that, nothing criminal have gone on in that regard is far too low a bar for Canada. I think Canadians expect, and the Prime Minister highlighted in his mandate letters at the beginning of this Parliament and subsequently that the standard of ethics for his government and for his ministers would go beyond simply meeting legal requirements for ethics, but that ethics to him, he said, meant going above and beyond those requirements, and not only not having done anything wrong, but to be seen to be not to have done anything wrong. And all of this reinforces the anxiety that I think a lot of Canadians feel, that there's one set of rules for wealthy and well-connected folks here in Canada and another set of rules for everyone else. There's certainly enough to feel like that may be happening, and I think until we get to the bottom of what's happening, Canadians are going to continue to lack confidence that that's the system they have and that it's working properly for them. So, I mean, as my colleague said earlier, it's why we think that the gold standard for restoring confidence on this is a public inquiry, not just to ensure that we can hear from everybody. So not just the people who are mentioned in today's motion. And I'd say that today's motion is really just a minimum in terms of who the committee can call. It just says for certain we should be sure to call these people. But of course, if the committee wants to call people beyond what's mentioned in the scope of the motion, the committee has every right to do that. And we certainly have some further suggestions about who we might hear from. But it's important that we launch the study, and then we can have those discussions about who else would be appropriate to include. So there's that question in terms of having that led by someone independent. But the other thing that a public inquiry would do would be to provide some findings, presumably, which was not something that we got out of the Justice Committee hearings so far, that would give Canadians some idea as to what are the salient facts and how to interpret those, and what should be the takeaway from what we've learned through all this testimony. The Justice Committee process, such as it was obviously inadequate. As I say, it didn't produce any findings, at least not as of yet, although it ought to have. There were clearly more people to hear from that we didn't hear from. And so, we're in an attempt to try and make sure that those other things that need to be heard get heard. And we've heard, I won't re-quote, but we've heard from Ms. Philpott that there's more to the story that needs to be told, and that she feels she has something important to contribute. We've heard from Ms. Jody Wilson-Raybould that there's more to the story that needs to be told, that she would like to tell, and that and there's two reasons why they're not able to do that. One is having an appropriate forum, and the second, and ultimately the most important, is being released by the Prime Minister and Cabinet from Cabinet confidence, so that they can say what it is that they have to say without fear of reprisal. And there are some arguments out there that I want to just take a moment to address, saying that they're already in a position to do so, which I don't believe is the case, not in any real or meaningful way. And those arguments, particularly in recent days, have had to do with parliamentary privilege and the nation and a cabinet oath. So the first thing I think that needs to be said about this, that we haven't heard enough in that discussion, and I would query my Liberal colleagues on, is just to say that, I mean, do we really want it to be the case that the only reason we think people who have served in cabinet would keep their oath of secrecy is on pain of being fired from cabinet? And so if they're already out of cabinet, then what's the point? Why would they bother? Surely we have to think that there's a higher threshold for keeping the secrets of Canadian cabinet than that you might get kicked out. That means that anybody who's no longer in the cabinet, who has served in cabinet, if we're to believe the Liberal line on this, could get up at any time in the House, and Liberals would have no problems with this, divulging cabinet secrets or details of what's happened at the cabinet table. We have other former members of cabinet who are still MPs and who could exercise parliamentary privilege. I'm surprised, although it seems to be an implication of the Liberal argument, that they can and could get up, no problem, anytime in the House and start talking about details of cabinet meetings and other important issues that have come before the cabinet table. I think that's incoherent, and it certainly doesn't meet the kind of standard that I think Canadians expect of their government. And the reason why people want to hear from Ms. Wilson-Raybould and from Ms. Philpott isn't because it's just because it's juicy to get information about what happened in a cabinet, and it doesn't matter what the details are. The reason why people want to hear from these particular former ministers is because we're concerned that the Prime Minister's office was inappropriately interfering in what should be an independent judicial system. And we're concerned not just because we're concerned, although we are, but we're concerned also because organizations like the OECD Anti-Bribery Unit have said that they are concerned. Mm-hmm. And so we want to clear Canada's reputation, and we want to get to the bottom of what's happening. So this isn't just any circumstance of something that happened under the rubric of cabinet confidentiality that these women are being asked to talk about. And it doesn't make sense to say that, oh, well, because they have parliamentary privilege, anyone who has cabinet secrets could just get up in the House at any time. I don't think that that's a credible argument, and I think we should all be giving more respect to the oath of cabinet. So that's why it was important to get a waiver in the first place. That was something that the Prime Minister seemed to recognize when he issued a waiver to Ms. Jody Wilson-Raybould in the first place. He might have been thinking of the Treasury Board directives on cabinet confidence, which state in Section 5, and I'll just quote because I think this is important for members, particularly Liberal members who are out talking in the media about this, to know that these guidelines state there is no discretionary power provided to an individual minister or government institution to make a cabinet confidence accessible to the public. That's pretty clear. And that's a government document. That's not me making that up or coming up with that. That's a document that lays out the expectations around cabinet confidence. That's something that the Prime Minister seemed to understand when he issued a waiver in the first place. The only problem with that waiver was that it didn't extend for the full period in question. It stopped when Jody Wilson-Raybould was fired from the position of Attorney General and doesn't permit her to speak about the things that happened between then and when she resigned from cabinet. Now, it's perfectly plausible. Anybody who's ever had somebody in their life who is behaving in a way that you thought was erratic or strange and then discovered a detail that helped make sense of that behavior in hindsight will understand that it's perfectly plausible that something happened after she was fired from the post of Attorney General that made her go, that wasn't all a coincidence. That wasn't just a mishmash of meetings with different people who were concerned, but actually that was something quite deliberate and there was more to it. And she's hinted that there is something more to tell. I think Canadians deserve to be able to hear what that is. And if the Prime Minister doesn't feel that that something is incriminating and that he did nothing wrong, I don't understand. And if he's of the view that she could have said it under privilege at any time, well, it raises the question, why did you issue a waiver in the first place? The waiver, incidentally, which is confined not just in terms of the period of time, but also specifically to the Justice Committee hearings. Why issue that waiver in the first place? Why wasn't the position in the first place that she could share whatever she wanted to share under the rubric of parliamentary privilege? And it seems to me that the answer, the only credible answer I can come up with for that, is that the Prime Minister was concerned to limit her ability to speak only to the Justice Committee study, which we found was then summarily cut short by Liberal members on that committee, and that he was concerned that she only be able to talk about a particular point in time. So now, outside of that study and outside speaking about only that period of time that the Prime Minister wants her to be able to speak about, the risk is on her. And it's a risk that she will face legal proceedings. And it may be that ultimately a court will decide that parliamentary privilege trumps, but that's only after potentially it gets dragged through the courts for a long time. That's only after there are potentially other career implications, even outside of politics. We've heard a former law clerk who said it's unlikely she would be prosecuted for breach of trust and other things, but not that it's impossible. And we all know that court cases come with real costs, financial and otherwise. And even if you're vindicated in the end, by the time you get to the end of that process, it can be cold comfort that you were ultimately right. And all of this is happening, and the reason why she would have to take that risk if she spoke under parliamentary privilege is only because the Prime Minister refuses to give her permission to just tell her story. If the Prime Minister gives that permission, all of these debates go away. She could be released to go talk about this at a press conference, not just within the confines of a parliamentary committee, or having to awkwardly find time in the House when we all know no member can get up and speak about anything that they want at any time, subject to no conditions. And we haven't seen an effort from the government to work with the other parties to try and set aside that time. Where there was a space created at the Justice Committee, that was closed down. We're going to find out later today whether or not this becomes a space for that testimony to take place. And there hasn't been the kind of cooperation that you would expect. To make it easier to create that space at this committee, again, only because the government, and particularly the Prime Minister, by order in council, isn't making it easy by extending the waiver, we're trying to create that space. And our amendment today is about making it easier for our Liberal colleagues to create that space. Our amendment takes out some of the more politicized language in Clause A of this motion. The motion, if this amendment passes, would no longer refer to corruption. It defines clearly and relates clearly to the mandate of this very committee to take away all doubt that there is an appropriate way of tackling this issue at this committee that bears upon the proper work of this committee. And that's why we refer to the particular standing order. And the other thing that this amendment does that isn't so much for our Liberal colleagues, the first part is, the second part is for Canadians who want to understand the decision making on these files and want to understand why they're getting to hear or not getting to hear the full story. and that's having a public vote. Because when the Justice Committee process was shut down, that was done in private. Canadians didn't really get to hear the reasons why. They heard the reasons why that Liberals gave afterwards in the press conference, but they didn't get to hear the discussion. This is a discussion we're perfectly comfortable having in public. We think it's a discussion Canadians deserve to hear. They deserve to hear the reasons why, the real reasons why Liberals have voted against this motion. It's why I hope we don't proceed to a vote without hearing from any Liberals today. I think it would be a shame if they didn't put anything on the record that indicated why they're voting one way or another. That would be a shameful spectacle, to walk out of here and have no indication as to, on the record as to why it is that they would vote against this motion. And so all we're asking for is for that vote in public, and I hope we're going to hear from one of them before we have that vote, so that Canadians can understand, if this doesn't go ahead, why it's not going ahead. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Blakey. Next up, we have Mr. Weir speaking to the amendment once again. Mr. Weir.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I guess I'd just like to add a couple of points that I think would be very worthwhile for this committee to consider. The first one is that in cases of wrongdoing abroad, such as what SNC-Lavalin has been accused of, I think that our objective should be to hold accountable the people guilty of the wrongdoing, while at the same time not unduly damaging Canada's economic resources. Now, there's been a lot of debate about this figure of 9,000 jobs. I and others have been skeptical about that number, but I think at the end of the day, there's no doubt that charges and convictions and a ban from federal contracts against SNC-Lavalin would do some pretty serious damage to a very important Canadian enterprise, the largest construction company in Canada. So it strikes me that there's a bit of a dilemma here about how to go after wrongdoing without having these negative side effects on our economy. There was a disagreement within the government about whether a deferred prosecution agreement would be an appropriate tool to achieve that goal of going after the wrongdoing without damaging the economic assets. It strikes me something the committee should consider is whether we should be entirely focusing on penalizing the company either through a prosecution or a deferred prosecution agreement, or whether that goal might be better achieved with a renewed focus on prosecuting the individuals who actually committed the wrongdoing. So it seems to me that there is a place sometimes for prosecuting companies. There may be a place for deferred prosecution agreements, but one of the best ways to achieve the goal that I think we all want to achieve is to put a renewed emphasis on prosecution of the actual individuals within that enterprise who are accused of paying bribes and corruption abroad. Mr. Chair, the second point I would encourage this committee to consider is that in this new area for Canada of deferred prosecution agreements, there clearly needs to be some sort of oversight or some sort of possibility of appeal beyond just one individual, the Director of Public Prosecutions. And that oversight or appeal needs to be from someone who is independent, someone who isn't political. And a big part of the problem in the SNC-Lavalin case is that the only way to appeal a decision of the Director of Public Prosecutions was to go to an Attorney General who was not just a member of Parliament, but also a member of Cabinet, also the Justice Minister. So one way that's been suggested to achieve some sort of independent oversight or review in these very complex and difficult decisions would be to reinforce the independence of the Attorney General by splitting that portfolio from the Justice portfolio. I think that would be a possibility that this committee should consider. There might be other ways of coming up with some sort of mechanism for review or oversight of decisions of the Director of Public Prosecutions in an independent, nonpartisan way. That's one idea that's been floated. I would encourage the committee to consider it and others Thanks very much for the opportunity, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Weir. Next up, we have, again, speaking to the amendment, Mr. Gord. Go ahead.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Je vais prendre seulement quelques minutes pour ajouter mon grain de sel à cette discussion. Je vais essayer de ne pas répéter ce que les autres ont dit. Par contre, dans la vie de parlementaire que nous vivons, il y arrive des occasions où on doit prendre des décisions face à des intérêts ou avec notre conscience, et j'espère que mes collègues d'en face pourront le faire avec toute la liberté qu'il se doit face à cette situation qui inquiète beaucoup de Canadiens et qui nous inquiète aussi. De prendre la décision aujourd'hui de permettre aux ex-ministres qui malheureusement ont dû quitter leurs fonctions. Ces personnes-là ne l'ont pas fait de gaieté de cœur, sûrement, et ont choisi une voie très courageuse. Parce que renoncer à des fonctions aussi importantes pour aider les Canadiens, par principe, et ne pas pouvoir expliquer aux Canadiens pourquoi ils l'ont fait, ça demeure très troublant, et pour nous, qui faisons le même métier que ces personnes-là, on se demande à quel point leurs consciences ont dû être dévastées pour prendre cette décision. Donc, je pense que notre motion ici est très légitime et ça revient sans doute à notre comité, parce qu'au comité de la justice, ils l'ont refusé. Ils l'ont refusé parce que la justice, sans doute, elle a été respectée. L'ex-procureur général a dit simplement non, et ça l'a été non. Donc, la justice a été rendue face à au ministère de la Justice. Mais s'il y a eu des conflits d'intérêts ou s'il y a eu des pressions, ça revient vraiment à notre comité ici de faire la lumière sur les agissements peut-être de certaines personnes et sur toute la pression qu'on a, nous, les parlementaires, face à ces situations-là, quand on obtient des niveaux aussi importants qu'être ministre, d'être procureur général, d'être ministre du Conseil du Trésor ou n'importe quel autre ministre, quand on tombe dans des obligations exécutives. Ici, vraiment, il faut vraiment protéger la séparation entre la justice, le politique et l'exécutif. C'est la base même de notre démocratie et c'est toute la confiance des Canadiens qui est mise dans notre système qui nous dirige et qui nous oriente vers une société vraiment qu'on aspire tous. Malheureusement, on semble que notre pays ne va pas dans la bonne voie. On reçoit même à l'international des signes qui nous disent carrément de faire un ménage chez nous. Et beaucoup de gens sont déçus. On n'aurait jamais pensé que notre pays serait rendu à ce genre de situation-là parce qu'on a toujours défendu la liberté d'expression, on a toujours défendu une société de droit à l'international. Là, on se fait cogner sur les doigts. Là. Puis on comprend pas pourquoi. On comprend pas à quel point les dommages peuvent être à court, moyen et long terme. Et la responsabilité qu'on a tous aujourd'hui, c'est une responsabilité quasi historique, car on doit permettre à la vérité d'être dit et on se doit de donner l'occasion à ces personnes de le faire librement. Et j'interpelle toutes consoeurs et confrères à prendre la meilleure décision qui soit. Ça arrive dans la vie de parlementaire où on doit prendre des décisions difficiles. Mais il ne faut jamais oublier qu'on est là pour l'ensemble des Canadiens, pour la vie et l'avenir des Canadiens. Et nos institutions, on se doit de les protéger. C'est à nous qui revient cette responsabilité. Et on va savoir peut-être dans quelques instants ou dans quelques minutes, est-ce que cette histoire-là va continuer d'une façon plus transparente avec ce qui va arriver, ou l'abcès va continuer de grossir. De prendre la décision de crever un abcès, c'est sûr que sur le coup, ça fait mal, ça sent pas bon. Mais à un moment donné, il y a des choses qu'on doit faire pour guérir, puis là, pour guérir vraiment notre société. Donc, c'est à nous d'avoir le courage de nos actions et j'espère que ça va aller dans le bon sens. Merci, M. le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Gord. We'll go back to Mr. Kent to respond to the amendment, to the motion.
Thank you, Chair. And I'd like to thank Ms. Ramsey for proposing certainly what I consider to be a friendly amendment to the motion, and Conservatives will accept that proposed amendment to the motion and vote for.
So we'll go to Mr. Erskine-Smith to respond to the amendment. Go ahead.
Mr. Blakey, of course, I'm not just going to let people quote liberals. I'll say something myself. Although Mr. Kent and Mr. Poilievre, you sound great quoting liberals in comparison to your normal selves. In jest. I want to start actually by agreeing with Mr. Kent. It is outrageous that there's a leak with respect to the Supreme Court judicial appointment process, and without question, that kind of leak undermines the confidence in the judicial selection process and appointment process. So I think people from all parties ought to condemn that kind of thing. Completely inappropriate. I also want to acknowledge, I mean, I've voted for a more public-facing inquiry to get at the truth, but I think everyone on this side cares at getting to the truth. It's just a question of how we can best do that. And so you'll remember, Mr. Kent, informally when the SNC story started in the news, I had come to you and come to Mr. Angus and said, is this something that you think we would look into? And I think if at that time, before justice was seized with it, if at that time we had seized it instead, we would have absolutely been an appropriate forum, and then the waiver would apply to this committee. And I can speak for myself. I don't know that it would have been closed down quite so quickly, but the fact of the matter is we are where we are now, and the waiver does not apply to this committee. And more than that, I didn't hear anyone say today already that Ms. Wilson-Raybould has written a letter to the Justice Committee and said, not only do I have more to say, but I am going to say it. And no one is going to hold her back from writing a submission to justice, providing emails and text messages, and having spoken with Mr. Housefather and also seen his public statements, I understand all of that information is to be made public. And so for me, in my previous lifetime as a lawyer, we would call motions like yours, Mr. Kent, premature. But to me, it makes far more sense to see what is said in that public statement, to see how justice reacts to that, frankly, and whether they think any of that new information is something worth reconsidering their previous decision to close off their study, and for us to, if necessary, revisit this conversation. But frankly, at this time, justice is seized with it, the waiver applies, and there are more documents forthcoming to justice. It seems like we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves at this committee, when even if we had Ms. Wilson-Raybould and Ms. Philpott sitting there, I know, because they take their oath very seriously, having spoken to them both, that they're not going to be able to say anything to our committee because of the oaths that they've made and because the waiver doesn't apply. And even if a similar waiver applied to our committee, we'd be relitigating, with Ms. Wilson-Raybould in particular, we'd be relitigating the very same information that she's providing, not only that she provided in person, but that she's now going to provide in writing. And so my view would be twofold. One, I think this is appropriately before justice, and we ought to wait and see what justice does in the wake of the additional information that is provided. And two, and not everyone here today has been part of our inquiry into Cambridge Analytica, but I've said this publicly in interviews already. I have not found committees like ours to be very effective at conducting inquiries. When we had AIQ come before us and they provide written documents, the ability for our committee to do the work of effectively a commissioner. It was very important for us to do that kind of work and to pass it off to the Privacy Commissioner, but for us to conduct that inquiry ourselves, we clearly ran into roadblocks and were unable to proceed based on our inability to compel documentary production in the same way, our inability to revisit testimony in the same way. Frankly, the tools we have at our disposal are more cumbersome, and the Privacy Commissioner was well placed to pursue that further. In this case, what can we do if we want to get at the truth as far as this committee is concerned that is within our purview? Well, the Ethics Commissioner reports to us, and the Ethics Commissioner has undertaken, as I understand, in a letter to Mr. Cullen and to Mr. Angus, that he's proceeding with an investigation. I know that the Ethics Commissioner is to attend before this committee for estimates in early May already. If we want to bring him here earlier, so be it, if that's the will of the committee. But certainly I think it's fair for us to ensure that the Ethics Commissioner has the tools, resources, and mandate to do his job effectively and to do his job in a timely fashion, such that we are able to get at the truth. When I voted the way I did for a more public-facing inquiry, it was because I did not think that committees were best placed to do this kind of work, and I thought that an independent, nonpartisan, commissioner-style process was much more effective. And if the Ethics Commissioner doesn't have a full mandate to do this kind of work, we can ask those questions. We can ask him about the limitations that he might have to his mandate, and he can express concerns if he has any. And I think that fundamentally is the job that this committee should undertake with the current waivers as they apply and with the status quo as it is. And if additional documents and testimony are produced that would make me change my mind, then so be it. But as I say, I hate to be technical, but I think the motion is premature.
Thank you, Mr. Erskine-Smith. To respond to that amendment, once again, Mr. Kent.
Well, thank you, Chair, and I thank the Vice Chair of this committee for a very thoughtful response to the motion, to the presentation by all members on the opposition side of the table. And I sense that I see the direction that he and his colleagues will take in terms of voting on this motion and the amendment. But he should not be surprised that I disagree with him on a number of points. First of all, it is true that the Justice Committee has agreed to receive the transcripts and records offered by Ms. Wilson-Raybould in response to other witnesses before that committee, but the waiver has not been extended to allow her to respond to those still important issues that both she and Ms. Philpott say they wish to speak to. And our motion says in B that a formal request be made by a committee chair, by our committee chair, to write a letter to the Prime Minister and to request that he waive all constraints that would apply to any individuals that the committee may decide to invite, whether it be Ms. Wilson-Raybould or Ms. Philpott primarily, or to others who I believe do have a right to respond to Ms. Wilson-Raybould's testimony, as well as to the clerk and to the former principal secretary. With regards to the AIQ investigation, I agree. This committee did not have the tools or the authority to demand completely honest responses from the executives of AIQ, and we stated such in our report. They were unwilling witnesses. There's no question about that. They had to be dragged kicking and struggling to come back before this committee to not answer questions that we still had. I think certainly in the case of Ms. Wilson-Raybould and Ms. Philpott, we have willing witnesses that are anxious to present testimony. And if indeed the Justice Committee in reopening or accepting and releasing the documents that Ms. Wilson-Raybould will table sooner or later, there is a possibility, although I sense it's remote, that they would reopen their study to include a request to the Prime Minister to extend the waiver or to remove entirely all constraints on their testimony. And third, with regards to the Ethics Commissioner's investigation himself, I think he has expressed in his appearances before us in the last within the last year, the last half year, his concerns that he doesn't have the necessary authority to conduct investigations to the extent that he would like, and that in fact his not only his order-making powers but the penalties that he may apply are rather modest. So, although again respecting and I appreciate your remarks with regards to agreement on the leak regarding the judicial appointment process, I think I would still urge you to support the motion before us today, with the understanding that it would not interfere or conflict with whatever remaining study the Justice Committee may wish to. Although again, I say I'm not not optimistic that beyond the release of whatever Ms. Wilson-Raybould intends to send to them, I'm not optimistic, given some of the statements by the members of that committee when it was shut down, that it might be reopened.
Thank you, Mr. Kent. We'll go next to Mr. Blakey again.
Thank you very much. So I guess the first thing I'd like to say in response to Mr. Erskine-Smith is that I don't accept that he speaks for his colleagues on the committee here. I mean, I take the argument from him, and of course the NDP would prefer to have a public inquiry. So if the argument is that he would prefer we have a public inquiry as opposed to what's being proposed today, we're happy to accept that any day of the week. Our impression is that that's not on offer, at least not so far. My question for all the other Liberals on the committee who voted against having a public inquiry is why they would be voting against this motion. And I'm not satisfied from Mr. Erskine-Smith's answer, which is particular to him, that we have the reasons why they will be voting against this motion. And I think Canadians deserve to hear why Liberals who are not supportive of a public inquiry are also not supportive of creating other forums for Ms. Wilson-Raybould and Ms. Philpott to come forward. We don't yet have that. We should have that before the vote. I invite all five of them to give their own reasons, as Mr. Erskine-Smith has done. I also would just like to say that I take it from the position that because the waiver doesn't extend to this committee, if we take that as a reason not to invite the Prime Minister, as this motion does, and as Mr. Kent has pointed out, that this motion does invite the Prime Minister to extend the waiver, that the Prime Minister would refuse to cooperate with an independent committee of Parliament. It's from the Prime Minister himself and from his House Leader. Often in the House, we have heard that they respect the work of parliamentary committees, and I think if a parliamentary committee therefore said that they thought it was appropriate to study this issue, and they wanted to hear from these witnesses, that the Prime Minister should have no problem in extending the waiver, as he did somewhat for the Justice Committee. So, I mean, I also just don't accept that as an argument. I think it's important that this committee express its desire to get to the bottom of this issue, and that it make a request, as this motion would, of the Prime Minister to extend that waiver. So that's part of what we're doing here today. We're not just trying to launch a study at the Ethics Committee. We're also trying to call on the Prime Minister to extend that waiver out of fairness for Ms. Wilson-Raybould and for Ms. Philpott, who want to be able to tell their story. That's part of what we're doing here today as well. And so I think that's an important point that ought not to get lost. And I would hate to think that, all of this talk about respecting the work of committees and wanting to allow them to do the work that they see fit was disingenuous in the House. And I take that by implication that that's the position of the Liberals on the committee, if they think that somehow if we call for this study and ask for the extension of the waiver, that the Prime Minister wouldn't grant it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Blakey. Up next, Mr. Weir.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. I think that Mr. Erskine-Smith raises a valid point that Ms. Wilson-Raybould is in the process of making a written submission to the Justice Committee, and that written submission would probably be of interest to members of this committee before undertaking a study of some of the same issues. in the spirit of trying to find a reasonable compromise, I wonder if Liberal members of this committee would be amenable to tabling the motion before us until after we've had a chance to see Ms. Wilson-Raybould's written submission rather than voting it down altogether.
Certainly, Mr. Ware, you're able to suggest that, but not as a current sitting member of the committee. That would be something that they would have to consider, I guess, and could talk about after.
Yeah, I'm just suggesting that I recognize someone else would actually have to make
Yes.
the motion to table it.
Yeah,
Yes.
thank you, Mr. Ware. We'll go next to Ms. Ramsey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to address some of the things that have been said by my colleague. First of all, that it's, maybe not the appropriate place at this particular committee. And I want to again reiterate that the Ethics Committee deals with lobbying. And at the heart of this story, what we're talking about is extensive lobbying from SNC to influence the Prime Minister, the Finance Minister, Michael Warnick, to intervene and to go to the former Attorney General to pressure her to change her mind. So lobbying is absolutely within the scope of this committee, and I believe that it really does firmly belong in this committee as a study. Committees may not be the best place to hear this, and I completely agree that the gold standard is the full public independent inquiry. But if the Prime Minister was going to do that, he would have already initiated it. We are seeing clearly that that's not going to happen. If it was going to happen, we'd have it launched. This is 7 weeks of torture for Liberals. Every single day, the story changes and becomes worse. If you truly believe that the Prime Minister wanted to have a full independent public inquiry, we would already see evidence of that. Canadians would already see that. So I agree with you, committees aren't the best place, but it's the only place we currently have. The only place that we have to be able to have a forum, to create space for people to be able to speak who very publicly indicated that they would like the opportunity to do so. So it may not be the best, but it's the only option before us right now as parliamentarians. And the other thing I want to talk about is, first of all, before I leave the committees, I have to say that the Justice Committee has been very clear. The study is done. There is no further conversation or study. There have been multiple attempts to bring this back to the Justice Committee that have been voted down by members of the Justice Committee. No one in Canada believes that the Justice Committee is going to revisit that. And I say that as a member of the Justice Committee, as Vice Chair of the Justice Committee. There is absolutely no indication that they will entertain any further conversation. The letter from Ms. Wilson-Raybould to the Justice Committee is very narrow in what it represents. She was asked a direct question by Mr. Rankin during her testimony, and the letter that she has sent is a response to that direct question. It's very limited. I do not believe that we will anticipate some big, long, full statement from her coming to the committee. She has indicated she will provide the text messages and the emails as was requested of her by Mr. Rankin. That is what we can expect to see inside of that communication, if you will. But that communication will land at the Justice Committee and nothing will be done with it. There is no study that indicates that something must be done with it. There is no will towards doing anything with it. It will come, but how meaningful will that be if there's just simply a letter that becomes public? What I think is going to happen is it will raise even more questions than we currently have. So the idea that this letter is going to clear everything up, I think is not the case at all. And I think it's being taken out of context in the spirit that it was delivered. I mean, she even references a report. There's no report. There's no study at Justice Committee, so there's no report to come forward. The Justice Committee is not going to revisit it. I think that Canadians understand that and see that clearly. And as a member of that committee, I'm telling you that I do not believe there will be any further efforts at the Justice Committee in terms of this particular focus. So we land back at Ethics Committee, which is just another space for us to have this study. And it's entirely appropriate. It's entirely appropriate to have that here, regardless of what she may say. And if there isn't an order in council for this committee, then I'm certain that Liberal members can go to the Prime Minister and say, we need an order in council for the Ethics Committee, and we need for you to expand it. Don't limit it in a way where it leaves so many questions unanswered. And you have your own members who are going out publicly and saying, there are things to say beyond this scope, please let us say them. I think in the interest of fairness, that you should pursue the study here. You should allow the study here is really what we're talking about, let's be honest, because you hold the majority of the votes and we all can count. So ultimately, you're holding the fate of this truth coming to light for Canadians in your vote today, because the Justice Committee will not revisit this. Multiple attempts from the opposition parties there to see that happen. And we're left with what other options? Other committees where Liberals have majorities, where you will continue to listen to, I think, very reasonable arguments that any reasonable Canadian can see a path forward on, and yet vote along your party lines in order to support your Prime Minister and keep the truth from Canadians. So I would like you to consider those things, because I really believe that all that we have at this point is this committee. And, you know, when you were like, Liberals have been out talking about parliamentary privilege, they can just stand up, they can just say this. If you really want them to be able to speak their truth, if you really want them to have a space, here it is. We're offering it to you. It's on a silver platter. We're saying, here's the space for something that you're telling Canadians that you want. You want them to be able to speak. You would like that to be able to happen. Here it is, all packaged up for you to say, yes, we also would like our colleagues to be able to have an opportunity to speak. And yes, we would like the truth for Canadians.
Thank you again, Ms. Ramsey. Next up, Mr. Poliev.
Thank you. I just wanted to very quickly to respond to something Mr. Weir said. He mentioned that a deferred prosecution agreement might be necessary in order to protect the company's ability to get federal contracts. That is actually not true. That is another falsehood that has been disseminated about this controversy. The government has already granted an exemption to the ineligibility and suspension policy, and that exemption allows SNC-Lavalin to continue to bid on federal projects, even though it would otherwise be banned due to its charges. And the government has already indicated plans to extend that exemption even if the company is convicted. So the company can get an exemption even after convicted from the ban on federal bidding. If that were the government's only goal here in shelving these charges, it doesn't need to interrupt the trial. It can do so under its current with its current powers with an exemption from the bidding ban. But to Mr. Erskine-Smith, he mentioned that the motion is premature, that we ought not hear from Jody Wilson-Raybould until such time as she's had her chance to submit her additional documentary evidence to the Justice Committee. We would be prepared to amend the original motion to read that she would appear here within a week of having submitted additional documentary evidence to Justice. That would solve the problem that Mr. Erskine-Smith is worried about. It would ensure that her documentation is received by committee, published by that committee's chair, available to all committees around all members around the table, and that way we would all be dealing with the most up-to-date evidence when the hearings go ahead. So I know I don't control the speaking list, but I'd invite Mr. Erskine-Smith to respond to that compromise.
Okay, so we do have the amendment before us. I guess it's a friendly amendment to the amendment, to the motion. And he has asked, and we have Mr. Kent up next, but would you like Mr. Erskine-Smith to respond first? Go ahead, Mr. Erskine-Smith.
To the extent that it makes sense to consider this question on a later occasion, it would make far more sense, in my view, to see the documentary production, see what is said, see if there is anything new there substantively that needs to be addressed, see how justice reacts to that. And I take, Ms. Ramsey, your concerns to heart, but it's still appropriate, I think, as far as our parliamentary colleagues are concerned, to see how they react and where that committee is properly seized with it, and then to make a determination. I don't think it makes any sense today to make any determination when we don't know what is to come. And so, Mr. Kent, if you want to have this conversation again down the road, but my view, as I've expressed, is we are going to have the ethics commissioner sit right here, and we're going to be able to put to him questions about limitations or problems or problems with insufficient resources, problems with his mandate, or if he is sufficiently tasked with this. And those are the questions I think that this committee should be seized with right now, absent new information that we don't know yet what is to come. So, I respect the attempt to put this back on the agenda for me today, but the fact that this is premature isn't cured by saying, well, let's make a decision today and have it take effect a week from now.
Seeing this as a bit of a conversation, I'll put it back to Mr. Polyev, and then we'll move on to Mr. Kent.
All right. So I had understood Mr. Erskine-Smith's position to be that we needed to see the evidence that Madam Raybould Wilson would provide the Justice Committee, and that we couldn't hear from her until that time. So I think I had a solution that would allow us to do that. I still think we unfortunately we don't appear to have support for that compromise. That said, I think we should vote on the motion and the amendment here and give Liberals an opportunity to either put up or cover up as is their option, as are their options. And then I take from Mr. Erskine-Smith's position that even if the motion doesn't pass, he'd be willing to reconsider after Ms. Wilson-Raybould's information is tabled before the Justice Committee. So that is another avenue to be pursued down the road.
Thank you, Mr. Polyev. We'll go to Mr. Kent.
Well, thank you, Chair. And I understand the attempt to use premature consideration of this vote, but I think that it is important, as we have heard from everyone on the opposition side here today, that we get an indication. I don't think a no vote based on this goes far beyond the current situation before the Justice Committee and the submission that Ms. Wilson-Raybould will be making there. I do agree that it may well be necessary for us to bring a subsequent motion which responds to the reality of whatever the Justice Committee does do once they've received those submissions. But Chair, I would suggest we go ahead with consideration of the motion and the amendment to the motion before us today.
I have two other speakers still wishing to speak. The vote and the amendment for the vote for the amendment has been called. Do you still want to speak to the amendment? Okay, go ahead, Mr. Blakey.
Partly, I'd just like to address some of what's been said in conversation, particularly the idea that we ought to wait on an appearance by the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner in order to undertake a study. There's a couple of issues with that. One is that we know it's been made public that the commissioner himself is sick and on an indeterminate leave, and so we don't know that even though our parliamentary process around the estimates will continue, the commissioner himself may very likely not appear. Even if he did, if the investigation were still underway, I'm quite sure that it's not his usual practice to comment on investigations that are actually happening. So until he concludes his investigation, there would be nothing for him to say at this in this place. And further, with respect to that investigation concluding, without him back in his position, the Conflict of Interest Act, under which he reports in Section 44.7, says that the commissioner shall provide the Prime Minister with a report setting out the facts, etc. In other words, the Act says that only the commissioner provides that report. It's not clear that without an interim commissioner, and there has been no interim commissioner appointed, that report could actually be issued and therefore the investigation concluded. So absent having an actual interim commissioner, I don't think it makes sense for the committee to wait on the ethics commissioner's appearance before the committee, because we really have no idea when that would be. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Blakey. Last before the vote, I believe, is Ms. Ramsey. That's who we have on the list so far. So, Ms. Ramsey.
I just want to put onto the record that the chair of the Justice Committee, Anthony Housefather, has written an op-ed in the National Post commenting on the fact that he has drawn his conclusions already on the Justice Committee. And I just want to offer that as, I think, further evidence that there will be no further action at the Justice Committee. It would be quite, I still feel it's quite inappropriate for a chair who's meant to be impartial in the House of Commons to be writing publicly about an ongoing I would say, issue here on the Hill in general. But certainly in him going public and writing this op-ed, he's making it quite clear to Canadians that it won't return. And how can it possibly return with, his comments being made quite publicly and the fact that he now has drawn conclusions that it's done. So I just want to put that into the record that it will not be returning to justice. And if it does, it will just have kind of all of these things swirling around it about Liberals having already made up their mind on the committee, but now the chair being quite public about his personal opinions.
Any further comments on the amendment? Okay, a recorded vote, Mr. Kent.
Well, thank you, Chair. I would, it has been raised already, but I would appreciate hearing from other Liberal members of the committee with their thoughts of, with regards to both the motion and the amendment, but also to the conversation that has gone on across the table with the Liberal Vice Chair. And I would welcome any comments that that they might be willing to offer now.
I'll just quickly say, I think this is one of the very rare occasions where they're all going to let me speak for them.
Okay. I think that leaves the persons and members speaking to the amendment is exhausted at this point. So we'll call. I've heard a voice vote called by Mr.
Recorded vote.
Recorded vote, Mr. Kent. So go ahead. This is on the amendment, of course.
Mr. Erskine-Smith?
No.
Mr. Sani?
No.
Madame Fortier?
No.
Monsieur Lauzon?
No.
Monsieur Deferred-Graham?
No.
Monsieur Picard?
No.
Mr. Kent?
Yes.
Monsieur Gould?
Wait.
Miss Ramsey?
Yes.
So the amendment is defeated, 6-3. So now we'll move on to the motion before us. Is there any further debate or discussion on the motion? Recorded vote. So we're going to the vote. Go ahead.
Okay, Mr. Erskine-Smith?
No.
Mr. Sani?
No.
Madame Fortier?
No.
Monsieur Lauzon?
No.
Monsieur Deferred-Graham?
No.
Monsieur Picard?
No.
Mr. Kent?
Yes to end the cover-up.
Monsieur Gould?
Wait.
Miss Ramsey?
Yes.
6-3.
So the motion is defeated. So any further discussion before us today, before committee? Is there any further discussion? Any further discussion? I see none. We're adjourned. Thanks for coming, everybody.